pictures. It's really nice. So how are you today?
I'm good.
Okay, I have some questions about learning pronunciation.
Yes.
So could you please give our international students some suggestions and then to see how I can practice and what would be a best way to learn pronunciation at home?
Oh, that's a good question. I always recommend to students to listen a lot to natural pronunciation, watching movies in English, watching YouTube videos, listening to songs, singing along. Those are all really nice ways to get some practice, especially if you don't have exposure, if you're not living in America or Australia or England or an English-speaking country. There's so many resources online. YouTube is a great place to go. Yes.
So how will they, what do they need to do when they listen or, for example, watch a video on YouTube? Do they turn on the subtitle or what would you suggest them to do?
Well, different things work for different students. I know a lot of students really like to depend on the subtitles, and that might help for certain purposes, but I would say try both. If you're really used to the subtitles, try turning them off and seeing what you can take in. If you're using subtitles in your own language, that can be more of a crutch. It can be too much help, because your brain can't do two things at once. You'll be trying to read the subtitles, but you're not really listening to the language then. So I would really recommend to take off the subtitles. Now, I've had students use the English subtitles for English language videos, and that can be helpful. So if you hear words that you don't understand the sound of, you have it on the screen and you might recognize it. But if you're using subtitles in your own language, I would recommend not to do that.
Okay, so my next question is, could you say more about the different sounds for the same letter? For example, you talk about the separate sounds for the T.
Yes, I can. That's a good question. So I've taught linguistics to native-speaking American students in college. And this lesson even surprises them because there are sounds we think of, like I talked about several sounds for the letter T. So when we see T in a word, whether it's in butter or bottle or Betty or mountain, different accents will say that T in different ways. But all those people think of the sound as a T, right? So whether it's an American saying butter with that D sound, a Brit saying it with a T, butter, or a Cockney saying butter, we all think of that as the same letter. It's a T. So in linguistics, we teach that as the T that we have in our minds is a mental sound. It's not the physical sound. So in linguistics, that's called a phoneme. A phoneme is a psychological sound. It's all happening in your mind. What comes out of our mouths is called an allophone. An allophone allophones are the different types of sounds that are represented by that letter. For example, American English, if the letters T and P, what's another one, and K, at the beginning of a word have a puff of air, right? And that's distinct to the English language. Many other languages do not do that. Spanish, for example. So when I say the word take, you can feel that puff of air. But in Spanish, the word tengo, which starts with a T, does not have that puff of air. It's a different T sound, right? It's more like when T happens at the a middle, the middle of a word, it's not aspirated. So better in British English is not aspirated the same way that take is, right? So that's two different types of T. So those are two different allophones, or two different versions of the phoneme T, the mental sound of T. I'm trying to think of another example. The example of that glottal stop, so that sound in uh-oh, in words like mountain, rotten, cotton in American. Most of my American students would say mountain, rotten, cotton with a glottal stop.
Yeah.
But when they don't know that those are that's a different T sound, they all think they're saying T. They have to be taught that that's not a T. That's a glottal stop.
Yeah.
So that's the difference between a mental sound and the actual sound. And this is helpful for language students because they hear different things, and much of our language learning happens by reading. So we're reading letters on the page. And this is why I like to teach students a little bit of phonetics.
Yes.
So to learn some of those phonetic symbols, like the different symbols for that D sounding T, or the glottal stop, or a proper T. There are other examples with different letters too. But yeah, that's.
Yeah. I have the last question
Yes.
about the pronunciation and the accents. Yes,
Okay.
a lot of students in Taiwan will worry about like they don't really dare to speak English aloud because they think they do have strong accents, but sometimes it might be like just pronounce the word in the wrong way. So I want to think, what do you think about pronunciation and the accents, and then what they can do to get better?
Well, first off, don't worry so much about your accent, because people really don't care. And America is a very diverse place, especially if you're in America or England. They're very diverse countries with many, many accents, whether they're foreign accents or regional accents. So don't worry so much about your accent. Second, I have noticed that most pronunciation difficulties, and when I say difficulties, I mean being understood. If your accent is so strong that it's hard for people to understand you, oftentimes the problem is the word stress, right? So in English, the stress patterns of words are very important. So one example that comes up a lot with students from certain places, so in a word with many syllables like development, when I say development, you hear the stress on the second syllable, development. So if a student comes and they're in someone's accent, they say development instead of development, that just that little difference makes it very hard to understand. Even though all the syllables are pronounced correctly, if the stress happens in the wrong place, that can be really difficult for understanding. And one way to learn those stress patterns, of course, one way is just to listen and imitate what you hear.
Yes.
Another way is looking in dictionaries and pronunciation keys and thinking about, keeping in mind that you have to stress things on the right syllable. So if you read a word and you're not sure how to pronounce it, you can look it up. And nowadays there's recordings on the dictionary apps.
Just play.
So you just push play and you can hear it. But in the old days, we would read the transcriptions and dictionaries that would tell us where the stress was. And also to think about the stress patterns of whole sentences. For this, I like to use poetry in classes, especially older poetry like from Shakespeare. because if you read Shakespeare's sonnets, each line of Shakespeare's sonnets has a very particular stress. And in Shakespeare's sonnets, it's called iambic pentameter. So iambic means the beat goes da-da, da-da. So an unstressed followed by a stressed syllable. And there are 5 of those. Pent means 5, and amateur is the meter, right? So pentameter is 5, iambic pentameter is 5 of these iambs. So da-da, 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 da-da. And that's every line of Shakespeare's sonnets follows that rhythm. Da-da, 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 da-da,
So
da-da.
let's say when we speak in English, like the rhythm we need to
Right.
have.
So Shakespeare's sonnets are a little hard to read because it's very old-fashioned. But there are many other sonnets out there. If you Google sonnets, and you can get modern sonnets and old sonnets, but maybe the most famous line of Shakespeare is, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" It's the first line of one of his sonnets. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" You can hear that rhythm of the speech.
Yeah.
And if you learn that rhythm from poetry, you'll realize that 5-beat iambic pattern occurs in English very frequently. But it's nice to read it in poetry for when it's fun, can be. And 2, it shows you where those stresses in the words are, because a good poet has to make sure all those words fit that pattern. Right? So that's a good way to practice. Even reading Shakespeare sonnets, maybe you don't understand the meaning of it, but it still gives you that rhythm and the pattern of the sound. And music's also a good place for that. Music's a kind of
It's a good way for them to practice.
rhythmic language. And again, like I said, when we started off here, listening to English on videos and in movies can be very helpful for your accent to pick up pronunciation, stress patterns, and rhythms of natural speech.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's my
really
pleasure.
nice to
It's
have
an
you
honor.
here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.